It all started with an offer too good to refuse. Opportunities like this don't come around often. A job as a resident housekeeper in a mansion so large, it could have been taken from the pages of a luxury magazine. The salary? More than generous. It wasn't just enough to cover the bills. It was the kind of payment that promised a real future, a chance to dream bigger. There were benefits too. Meals provided, flexible schedules, and a cozy room tucked away in the mansion's east wing. It was the kind of work that people fight for. But somehow he fell into my lap. The interview was surprisingly brief. The woman who owned the house, Regina, she insisted that I call her, was as elegant as the house in which she lived. Her hair was perfectly combed, her clothes tailored and impeccable, but it was her presence that caught me off guard. She exuded calm, almost unnerving, as if nothing in the world could shake her. We sat in a sunlit office, the kind of room that practically screamed wealth. Huge windows let in rays of light that danced over polished hardwood floors and shelves stacked with books I doubted had ever been touched. Regina didn't seem interested in my professional history or qualifications. Instead, she offered me tea, smiled gently, and asked a question that stood out. "Do you believe in following instructions?" I laughed nervously, assuming she was joking. "Of course," I said, trying to match his composed behavior. She nodded, apparently pleased. She leaned back, her hands neatly folded in her lap. "Here, we have some specific rules," she said, her tone light but deliberate. "Nothing too complicated." His words hung in the air for a moment, heavier than they should have been. She didn't elaborate, but something about the way she looked at me, as if assessing my reaction, sent a slight shiver down my spine. For a brief second, I thought about asking her what she meant, but the rational part of my mind ignored it. Rules were part of any job, weren't they? And the house, the salary, it was too good to pass up. Regina's confidence was contagious. His calm tone made it seem almost silly to worry. Whatever the rules were, they couldn't be something I couldn't handle. So I nodded, gave her my best professional smile and nodded. The rest of the interview was a blur. She didn't ask for references or previous employers, which struck me as odd, but I rationalized. Maybe she just trusted her instincts. Perhaps the grandeur of the mansion and its wealth gave him the luxury of not worrying about the little things. Or maybe, just maybe, she already knew more about me than she let on. When she shook my hand and said, "Welcome to the family," there was something about the way she lingered on the word family that sounded strange. But the contract was signed, and the keys to my room were already in my pocket. Looking back, I should have relied on that initial discomfort. The slight shiver I felt when she mentioned the rules. The way his smile didn't reach his eyes. The way the house seemed almost too quiet, even with its grandiose charm. Some opportunities seem perfect on the surface, but perfection comes at a price. And some offers, they should not be refused. On my first day, I realized that nothing too complicated was the understatement of the century. The paper was waiting for me on the immaculate marble kitchen countertop, carefully folded, as if its contents were as ordinary as a shopping list. But when my eyes scanned the first few lines, a sinking sensation began to form in my chest. This was not a to-do list or instructions on how to use the high-end appliances. No, it was a list of rules. At first, they seemed reasonable, even mundane. Never use the front door. Strange, but maybe it was just a peculiarity of the house. Rich people, I thought, have always had eccentricities. Don't touch the clock in the living room. Oddly specific, but that's okay. I saw no reason why a housekeeper would need to fiddle with an old clock anyway. But the more I read, the more disruptive the rules became. Never ask about the night guests. The house seemed isolated, miles from the nearest neighbor, and Regina had not mentioned visitors. Still, the phrase bothered me. Why couldn't I ask? Then there was the rule that paralyzed me. If you hear singing after midnight, don't leave your room. I reread it, hoping I got it wrong, but the words didn't change. Chance. My stomach churned, and I forced myself to look around the large, sunny kitchen, as if the warmth and brightness could dissipate the chill that was rushing up my spine. Who needed rules like these? Why were they necessary? The role did not end there. Below the rules was a final warning, written in elegant and deliberate handwriting. These rules are not suggestions. Break them at your peril. The last word remained in my mind as an unwanted guest. Risk. Risk of what? I was still staring at the paper when Regina entered the room, her presence as composed as ever. She smiled warmly, looking at the note in my hand. I see you found the rules, she said, as if we're not talking about anything more serious than cleaning products. I swallowed, getting a weak nod. Yes, but some of these. I hesitated, trying to choose my words carefully. They're a little unusual. His smile didn't waver, but there was a glimmer of something in his eyes, a steel spike behind his polite demeanor. Unusual perhaps, she said lightly, but necessary. She didn't offer an explanation, and I didn't insist on one. His gaze stayed on me just long enough to make the air heavy between us. You'll find, she continued, her tone softening, that this house has its own rhythm. It's better to respect him. She turned and left the kitchen before I could answer, leaving me alone with the list. For a moment, I thought about leaving. Maybe that job wasn't worth the money or the promises of comfort. But then I thought about the bills piling up, the opportunities I'd already missed, and the way Regina's calm confidence made my fears seem irrational. I folded the paper and put it in my pocket. The rules weren't that hard to follow, I told myself. What harm could there be in respecting some strange peculiarities? But as the day wore on, the house began to look different. Its vast corridors and high ceilings no longer looked majestic. They seemed hollow, as if the walls themselves held secrets. The clock in the living room, the one I wasn't supposed to ring, seemed louder than any clock should be. His ticking echoed through the halls like a heartbeat, constant and relentless. When the sun went down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though Regina had retreated to her wing of the house hours ago. The shadows stretched across the polished floors, up the walls, and the silence that fell over the mansion was abnormal, too deep, too still. I found myself lying awake in my room that night, unable to sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every moan of the old pipes, made my heart race. I grabbed the rules in my hand like a lifeline, my eyes scrutinizing them over and over again. Then, as soon as the clock struck midnight, I heard it. A low melodic sound, like voices singing in unison, echoing faintly through the halls. The warning on the paper flashed through my mind. If you hear singing after midnight, don't leave your room. My first instinct was to investigate, to peek through the door, just to confirm that I wasn't imagining. But when I reached the doorknob, my hand froze. The air looked different, thicker, heavier. And then I heard something else. Steps. Slow, deliberate, moving toward my door. The song got louder, closer, until it sounded like it was on the other side of the thin wood that separated me from whatever was out there. I pulled my hand back and walked away from the door, my breath caught in my throat. The footsteps stopped, and the singing ceased, plunging the house into a suffocating silence once more. I didn't sleep that night, and in the morning, I understood. The rules weren't just there to be followed. At the end of my first week, I started to notice something strange. Every night, without fail, luxury cars arrived at the long and winding entrance to the mansion. Sleek black sedans and shiny SUVs, the kind of vehicles you'd see in magazines, or parked outside exclusive events. From the small window of my room, partially hidden behind thick curtains, I watched them park in silence, one after the other. The passengers were equally intriguing. Men and women, always dressed in black, their movements precise and determined. Their faces were hard to see in the dim light, but their presence carried an air of authority, or menace. Each carried something: leather briefcases, polished metal boxes, or heavy, wrapped packages that seemed out of place in the refined elegance of the mansion. I couldn't hear what they said. If anything, cars would park for a moment, passengers would disappear into the house, and within minutes, vehicles would disappear back through the driveway as fast as they had arrived. It has become a nocturnal ritual. When the clock in the living room struck 11, the cars arrived, stayed just long enough to leave their mysterious cargo, and then left, as if they had never been there. The next morning, the house was always immaculate. No sign of the guests, no clue of the packages they brought. Even the slight tire marks at the entrance seemed to disappear. It was as if the mansion itself absorbed their presence, erasing any evidence of their visit. Curiosity tormented me. Who were these people? What were they bringing? And why did it all seem so staged, as a performance designed to keep me guessing? Finally, on the fourth night, I couldn't contain myself. When the familiar line of cars arrived, I opened my door just a crack and crawled down the hallway toward the stairs. The thick carpet muffled my steps as I peered over the railing. I saw Regina in the large lobby, her movements graceful, almost rehearsed. She greeted each guest with a wave, her smile polite but cold, like a hostess at a meeting she didn't particularly like. The guests handed her their packages without saying a word, and she placed them on a table near the stairs before taking them further into the house. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest, until the last car disappeared into the driveway. Then I went back to my room, my curiosity only increasing. The next morning, I decided to confront her. Regina was in the sunny kitchen, sipping tea as if she hadn't received a series of gloomy visitors just hours earlier. His posture was unshakable, his expression illegible. I couldn't help but notice. I began, choosing my words carefully. The cars at night, the guests, they leave things behind, don't they? Her cup of tea paused in the air for only a moment, so brief I could have imagined, before she gently placed it on the saucer. She smiled, the kind of smile that looked nice, but felt like a warning. You were watching, she said simply, as if commenting on the weather. I hesitated, feeling a sudden chill despite the warmth of the morning sun streaming in through the windows. It's hard not to notice, I admitted, trying to keep my tone light. Who are they? What's in the packages? Regina's smile didn't waver, but something in her eyes changed. A flash of something darker. She leaned forward slightly, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. Curiosity, she said softly, can be dangerous here. Her words hit harder than I expected, as if she had reached my chest and pressed my heart. I tried to laugh, but the sound died in my throat. Why dangerous? I pressed, despite the growing discomfort building up in my stomach. Regina tilted her head, her expression almost compassionate. Because this house is selective about what she shares, she said. And he doesn't always accept curious looks. I opened my mouth to answer, but she stood up abruptly, interrupting me. You've been doing well so far, she said, her tone reverting to polite indifference. Let's keep it that way, shall we? And with that, she left the kitchen, leaving me alone with more questions than answers. That night, I didn't stare at the driveway. I didn't dare. But as I lay in bed, holding the covers tightly around me, I heard the familiar hum of engines outside, and the soft click of the front door opening. The routine continued undisturbed. But this time, I could have sworn I heard something else. A faint knock on my door, soft and deliberate, as if testing my resolve. I froze, holding my breath, the words of the list of rules flashing in my mind. Never ask about the nightly guest. I stood still, silently, and waited until the sun came up before daring to move again. There are moments that last, moments that you wish you could forget, but you will never forget. This was one of them. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, or at least it started that way. I was cleaning the master bedroom, a space that seemed almost untouched. The bed was always perfectly made, the furniture dust-free, and the air smelled faint, almost barren, like polished wood and lavender. It was the kind of room that felt more like a museum exhibit than a place where someone lived. As I dusted off the shelves near the huge oak wardrobe, something caught my eye, a strange object hidden behind a pile of neatly folded sheets. At first, I thought it was a piece of decor, maybe some kind of antique, but when I pulled it into the light, I realized it was something else entirely. A mask. It was made of dark, weathered leather, its surface engraved with symbols that looked intricate and coarse, as if they had been carved by hand. The edges were worn, the kind of wear and tear that comes from frequent handling. What bothered me the most, however, were the hollow, empty eye sockets. They seemed to stare at me, as if the mask itself were alive and watching. Every instinct screamed for me to leave her alone. The rules I was given, unspoken or unspoken, scratched the back of my mind. But something about the mask appealed to me. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the sheer strangeness of finding something so out of place in a home that otherwise seemed meticulously controlled. I reached out, hesitating for a moment, before my fingers brushed the leather. The instant I touched it, a cold sensation ran through my hand, as if I were diving into icy water. The room felt heavier, as if the air itself had thickened, pressing on me. My breath was stuck in my throat, and all the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. That's when I felt the undeniable feeling of someone standing behind me. My breath was stuck in my throat, and all the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. That's when I felt the undeniable feeling of someone standing behind me. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, and froze. He was a man, tall, broad shoulders and dressed in an elegant black suit. His presence was overwhelming, filling the room in a way that made the walls seem to close. His face was pale, his eyes dark and piercing, and there was something about him that seemed familiar and strange, as if I should know him, but I didn't. For a moment neither of us spoke. He simply looked at me, his gaze quickly moving to the mask in my hands before fixating on my face. "You've been warned," he said, his voice low and firm, carrying a weight that made my chest tighten. I opened my mouth to answer, explain, apologize, but no sound came out. His words hung in the air like a final judgment, and at that moment, I realized who he must be. Her husband. Regina's husband. The man I'd heard whispers about but never seen. Before I could process what was happening, he stepped forward and ripped the mask from my hands with unsettling ease. His fingers lingered on her for a moment, and then he turned and walked out of the room without saying anything else. The door closed softly behind him, but the weight in the air did not lift. I stood there frozen, repeating his words in my mind. "You have been warned." When I finally found the courage to move, I looked back at the wardrobe, half hoping that the mask had returned to its hiding place, as if none of this had happened. But it was gone. I didn't mention the meeting to Regina. Somehow, I knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever had just happened felt like a test, one I had failed. That night, as I lay awake in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that touching the mask had changed anything, though I couldn't tell what. The house seemed quieter than usual, but the silence was different. It wasn't peace, it was the kind of silence that hides something lurking out of sight. And for the first time since I arrived, I realized that the rules weren't just about protecting the house. They were protecting me. But right now, I wasn't sure if they could do it. Some nights refused to be forgotten. This was one of those nights. It started with a sound, muffled, rhythmic and low, like a distant drum beat echoing through the silence of the mansion. At first, I thought I was dreaming, the kind of half-formed nightmare that feels real until you wake up. But as my senses sharpened, I realized that the sound was real, emanating from somewhere below me. The floor under my bed seemed to vibrate slightly, as if the fountain was directly below. I sat up, my heart pounding, the eerie silence of the house now broken by that constant, frightening noise. My first thought was the basement, a part of the mansion that I had been explicitly instructed to avoid. I tried to ignore him, to convince myself that he was nothing. But the sound got louder, deeper, taking on a rhythmic quality that eroded my curiosity. Before I knew it, I was standing, my bare feet moving silently across the cold wooden floor. I should have stopped. I should have remembered the rules. But something in the sound felt like a tug that I couldn't resist. The hallway was dark, the faint moonlight filtering through the tall windows casting long, gnarled shadows on the walls. As I walked down the grand staircase, I noticed the fainter glow coming out from under the basement door. My breath picked up as I approached, each step feeling heavier than the last. The door was ajar, not wide open, but enough to see the flickering flames casting erratic shadows on the stone walls beyond. My hand trembled as I pushed it lightly, being careful to avoid the creaking of the hinges. What I saw will haunt me forever. The basement was no ordinary basement. It was cavernous, much larger than the house above could justify, the walls lined with shelves containing objects I couldn't name. But it was the center of the room that held my attention, and my horror. They were there. All of them. The nighttime guests I watched from my window night after night. Their black suits and dresses were replaced by long, flowing robes, and each wore a mask, leather, porcelain, metal. Each was grotesque in its own way, adorned with symbols and designs that looked ancient and unsettling. They were in a circle, chanting words in a language I couldn't identify. The rhythm of their voices matched the sound that woke me up, a monotonous melody that made my skin crawl. In the center of the circle was a fire. Her flames licked upwards, unusually bright and strangely still, as if the time around her moved differently. Suspended above her was something. At first I thought it was a cloth package or a mannequin, but then it moved. My breath caught in my throat when I realized it was a person. Or at least it had been a person. His form was distorted, limbs very long, his face hidden under a mask like the others. The flames seemed to consume them slowly, deliberately, but there were no screams, no beating, just the constant rise and fall of the singing voices. I wanted to run, scream, do anything, but my body betrayed me, frozen in place as if the very air in the room held me captive. My hands grasped the edge of the doorframe, my knuckles white, as I watched the ritual unfold. Then, as if sensing my presence, the singing stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, the kind of silence that feels alive. All heads turned in unison to me, their masked faces reflecting the firelight. I couldn't see his eyes, but I felt his gaze, heavy and suffocating. Curiosity, a voice echoed from within the circle, deep and resonant, as if coming from the walls themselves. A dangerous trait. I don't remember how I got back to my room. One moment I was standing in the doorway, their gazes burning on me, and the next I was curled up under my blankets, shaking uncontrollably. The faint smell of smoke clung to my clothes, a reminder that what I had seen was not a nightmare. The next morning, the house was immaculate as ever. No smell of fire, no ash, no trace of the night's events. But as I passed Regina in the hallway, she stopped and smiled at me, her expression serene but her words full of menace. "Did you sleep well?" she asked, her tone almost mocking. I couldn't answer. I couldn't speak, afraid that if I did, she would somehow know what I had seen. That night, I didn't sleep. I didn't dare close my eyes, afraid of what I might hear, or what I might find myself if I let my guard down. But no sound came. The house was silent, too silent. The next morning, everything looked different, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Regina called me into her office after breakfast. His invitation was delivered with his usual grace, a polite but unmistakable expectation that I would not refuse. My legs were heavy as I walked down the long hallway, each step echoing unnervingly in the vast silence. His office, a room that once seemed cozy and inviting, now looked like a trap. The sunlight coming in through the big windows felt colder, harsher, as if it was exposing every vulnerable part of me. Regina sat behind her huge oak table, her posture perfect, a cup of tea in her hands. She looked as poised as ever, but her eyes, they were sharper, more penetrating, as if she could see right through me. "Come in," she said, her voice calm, almost comforting. She gestured to the chair in front of her, the same one I was sitting in during my interview. I sat down, my hands tightly clasped in my lap to keep them from shaking. My mind raced, replaying the events of the night before. The singing, the fire, the masked figures. Did she know? Did she know I had seen them? Regina placed her teacup gently and leaned forward slightly, her expression soft but illegible. "I wanted to talk to you," she began. "You've done well so far, adjusting to the routines of the house. Do I hope you're comfortable?" "Yes," I said quickly, my voice firm despite the discomfort twisting my gut. "It's okay." She nodded, her smile weak but present. "Good. That's what I like to hear." She paused, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. "Tell me, did you hear anything unusual last night?" The question hit me like thunder, the weight of it made my chest tighten. I forced myself to stay calm, to keep my breathing regular. "No," I lied, shaking my head. "I didn't hear anything." His gaze lingered on me, those sharp eyes searching mine for something unsaid. For a moment, I was sure that she could see right through me, that she knew everything. But then her smile widened, and she leaned back in her chair. "Excellent," she said, her tone warm, but carrying a bit I couldn't define. "Curiosity is a dangerous thing in this house. It's good to know that you're disciplined." I swallowed, shaking my head as if I nodded, though my stomach churned in discomfort. Regina's smile didn't waver as she picked up her cup of tea again, her voice light but deliberate as she added, "You'll be a great candidate for the next stage." The words froze me in place. Candidate? Next stage? What did she mean? I wanted to ask, to press her for answers, but something in her behavior stopped me. His calmness, his control, made the air around us seem heavier. It wasn't just her presence, it was the house itself, as if every inch of her was listening, waiting to see what I would do next. "Thank you," I managed to say, my voice lower than I intended. Regina nodded, sipping her tea with an air of finality, and I took that as my cue to leave. I left the office with a measured step, forcing myself not to look back. The hallway seemed longer than it should have been, the walls pressing against me, the faint smell of smoke from the basement still lingering in my mind. When I got to my room, I closed the door and locked it, my heart pounding in my chest. I repeated her words several times. "You'll be a great candidate for the next stage." For which stage? What was I being prepared for? And what would happen if I wasn't ready? I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the list of rules still tucked neatly on my bedside table. For the first time, I realized that these weren't just instructions, they were a test. And I was starting to think that I hadn't done as well as Regina thought. The house looked different now. It wasn't just a place to work or live. It was alive, pulsating with a dark energy I couldn't ignore. And Regina? She wasn't just the mistress of the house. She was something much more dangerous, and I was stuck in her game, whether I liked it or not. It all started with a simple mistake, a moment of idle curiosity that unraveled everything. I didn't intend to meet him. The list of rules had been my constant companion since the day I arrived, folded neatly on my bedside table, like a security blanket. It was my lifeline in this strange house, a reminder of the lines I couldn't cross. But one night, as I sat on my bed, turning the paper absent-mindedly in my hands, something caught my eye, a slight smudge of ink on the back. At first, I thought it was just a mark, maybe a coffee stain or a misplaced fingerprint. But when I unfolded the paper completely and turned it over, my stomach sank. There was something written. The back of the page was covered in 2 neat columns of handwritten names, each accompanied by a date scrawled on the side. The ink was faded in places, suggesting that some names had been written long ago, but others were recent. I scanned the list, my hands shaking. The names didn't mean much to me at first, strangers, maybe former employees, but the dates told a different story. Some were years apart, others just months. The most recent was only 3 weeks before my arrival. The more I looked, the clearer the pattern became. The dates were not random. They marked something, a sequence of events that always ended the same way. My breathing quickened as the realization emerged. None of the names came up more than once, and none of them overlapped. These were the people who worked here before me. And if the dates were correct, none of them had ever left the house. Hooray! Then my eyes found the end of the list, where a single name was written in fresh, dark ink. It was mine, and next to him a date. My heart stopped as I read. Months or even weeks were not left. It was days. The paper slipped out of my hands, floating to the floor as the walls of the room seemed to close in on me. I felt like the air had been sucked out, leaving me panting. My mind raced. I had to leave. I had to leave. But how? The rules warned me about everything. Doors that wouldn't open after a certain amount of time, sounds that couldn't be ignored, the dangers of going out at night. But they didn't warn me about it. Or maybe they did, and I just didn't understand. The list was not just a set of instructions. It was a countdown. The weight of what I had discovered weighed down me as I sat frozen on the edge of my bed. Memories of the strange occurrences of the house flashed through my mind. The chants, the whispers, Regina's unnerving calm, and the masked figures in the basement. Everything pointed to a horrifying truth. This house was not just a place to work. It was a trap. And my time was running out. I forced myself to move, picking up the paper from the floor and shoving it into my pocket. My mind was a blur, full of frantic plans and half-formed thoughts. Could I sneak out before the date? Could I find help? But every idea seemed futile. Regina's words that morning came back to me, chilling in their precision. You'll be a great candidate for the next phase. The next phase was not a promotion. It was not a test of my loyalty. It was a sacrifice. That night, I didn't sleep. The list seemed to be burning in my pocket, a reminder of the fate that awaited me. The house was very quiet, the air very heavy, as if he knew I had discovered his secret. When the clock struck midnight, I heard it again. The singing, the low, melodic hum rising from the basement, accompanied by the faint glimmer of firelight under my door. My date had not yet come, but I knew it was close. I sat there, holding the rules in one hand, and my trembling determination in the other. Somehow I had to survive. Somehow, I had to break the cycle. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was already one step ahead of me. And Regina? She wasn't just watching. She was waiting. I had to escape. Staying meant certain death. But leaving this house was like trying to escape from a shadow. Every instinct screamed for me to go, leave everything behind and never look back. But the house seemed to have other plans. Every door, every window, every possible exit was locked or alarmed, a fortress disguised as a mansion. At night, the walls seemed closer, the air heavier, the rules a cage that tightened with each passing moment. I told myself that I would escape during the day. It seemed like the only chance. Mornings, with their false sense of calm, were my best opportunity to escape unnoticed. But every time I tried, something got in the way. It all started with minor delays, a sudden task of Regina's that required my immediate attention, or a forgotten task that she casually reminded me of as I was approaching the door. Then there were the subtle looks of the staff that I had never fully noticed before. The butler, whose name I didn't know, seemed to stand in the doorways, his cold, expressionless face following me wherever I went. The gardener, who rarely entered, stood closer to the windows now, his eyes narrowing as I passed. But the worst was Regina herself. His seemingly infinite presence, his calm demeanor, always seemed one step ahead. Whenever I thought I had found a moment to escape, she appeared as if she had been summoned by my thoughts. "Are you going anywhere?" she asked, her tone light, almost amused. The question never seemed innocent, and his eyes, piercing and calculating, always contained the unspoken message, "We know." One afternoon, I came closer than ever. I had managed to finish my chores early, and had packed a small suitcase, hidden under the loose boards of my room. I planned to leave through the servants' entrance at the back of the house, the only place that didn't have cameras. As I snuck through the halls, my heart raced with the sound of every creak under my feet. I was just a few steps away from freedom when his voice stopped me. "Are you leaving yet?" I turned slowly and found Regina standing at the end of the hallway, her hands folded carefully in front of her body, her smile unwavering. "You were so quiet today. I thought maybe he wasn't feeling well." Her words were casual, but the way she spoke them made my blood run cold. She knew. She always knew. I was just going to get some fresh air," I stammered, holding the strap of my purse hidden behind me. "That's not very sensible," she said, her tone soft but firm. "You know how dangerous it can be out there, don't you?" I nodded numbly, my throat dry. "Yes, of course. I'm going to stay." His smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Great. We don't want anything to happen to you before the big day." The big day. The date written next to my name on the back of the rules. I retreated to my room, every nerve in my body screaming in frustration and fear. The house wasn't just a place, it was alive, watching my every move, and had already decided my fate. That night, I heard the familiar singing again. I was taller this time, more insistent, and the faint glow of the firelight flickered under my door. My hands clenched into fists as I sat frozen on the bed, my mind racing with thoughts of escape. I couldn't put it off any longer. The house knew my intentions, Regina knew, and yet I couldn't stop trying. Tomorrow would be different, I told myself. Tomorrow, I would run no matter the cost. But deep down, a part of me wondered, had the house already won? The night before my scheduled appointment, everything came into focus. Too late to change, too late to run away. It was right after dinner that the butler approached me. His expression was as empty as ever, but there was something different about his tone. A rigidity, an inevitability. "Regina asked you to clean the basement tonight," he said, his voice cutting and final. My stomach turned. The basement. The only place I tried to forget. The place where I had seen the masked figures, the fire, the profane singing. I wanted to refuse, to make up an excuse, but my voice failed. The rules, the unspoken ones, had tightened their grip around my throat. "Of course," I muttered, barely able to say the words. The butler gave a slight nod, turning around and leaving me alone in the dark hallway. I stood there for a moment, frozen, my mind racing with thoughts of what awaited me below. The date next to my name on the back of the rules flashed through my mind. Tomorrow. But something told me that tonight, it would all begin. I made my way to the basement door, the air getting colder with each step. My hands trembled as I grabbed the doorknob, opening it to reveal the familiar stone stairs descending into the darkness. In the background, a faint glow flickered, candles, their light casting dancing shadows against the walls. As I descended, the sound of my footsteps echoed in the cavernous space, each louder than the last. When I reached the bottom, I stopped. My breath was stuck in my throat. My heart was beating so hard that it felt like it could explode. The room was as I remembered it, too big, cold and empty, except for the circle of candles arranged on the ground. In the center was the altar, a slab of dark stone that seemed to pulsate with an energy I could feel in my bones. And there, deliberately placed on top, was the mask I had touched, the mask that brought Regina's husband to me with those scary words, "You've been warned." The symbols carved on its surface seemed to glow faintly in the flickering light. His empty eyes stared at me, empty but suffocating, as if daring me to come closer. It wasn't just a mask, It was a scorer, a sign of what I had become. And then it all made sense. The names on the back of the rules, the dates, the guests in their black robes and grotesque masks, the songs that filled the house at night. This was not a home. It was a ritual. And I wasn't just a housekeeper. I was the next offering. My legs felt like they were going to give way as the realization fell on me. The truth was so obvious now, so painfully clear. The rules weren't meant to protect me. They were meant to prepare me, to mold me into the perfect sacrifice. A noise interrupted my thoughts, a gentle drag behind me. I turned sharply, my pulse quickening, to find Regina standing at the top of the stairs. She looked serene, her hands clasped in front of her body, her expression unreadable. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said, her voice calm as if we were discussing art or the weather. The culmination of generations of devotion. I wanted to talk, scream, run. But I was rooted in the place, my body frozen as if the house itself wouldn't let me leave. "You did so well," she continued, walking down the stairs with a grace that seemed otherworldly. "By following the rules, proving himself worthy." Worthy of what? I managed to choke, even though I already knew the answer. Regina's smile widened, and for the first time I saw the truth in her eyes, cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of humanity. "To become something greater," she said, her voice soft but final. She gestured to the altar, her gaze almost reverent. "This is your moment, your transformation. Don't you feel honored?" I shook my head, my breathing shallow and ragged. "I didn't agree with that," I whispered. Regina tilted her head, her expression of pity. "You agreed the moment you stepped into this house. The moment he touched the mask. You were chosen." Behind her, others began to appear, masked figures emerging from the shadows, their presence suffocating. They formed a circle around me, their silent gazes heavier than any words. I stepped back, my heels hitting the edge of the altar. My mind screamed for me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The house, the rules, the ritual, everything led to that. Regina approached, holding the mask for me. "It's time," she said simply. The chanting began, low and rhythmic, echoing off the stone walls. The candles flickered wildly, their flames extending unusually high. I looked at the mask, my reflection distorted in his empty eyes. I knew then that there was no escaping it. No one ever left. When Regina put the mask over my face, the world went dark, and the singing became louder. My screams were swallowed up by the ritual, by the house, by the rules. And at that moment I understood. I hadn't been hired. I had been claimed. In the face of certain death, despair becomes courage. And that night, I found a courage that I didn't know I had. The singing grew louder, the rhythmic hum vibrating through the walls and into my chest. The circle of masked figures approached, their forms blurred by the flickering light of the candles. Regina stood at the altar, her face serene, her hands outstretched as she asked me to accept my fate. But something in me snapped. I wasn't ready to die. When their voices reached a feverish pitch, I saw an opening. The singing, the firelight, the overwhelming ritual. They were so focused on the ceremony that no one noticed I took a step back. Then another. My heartbeat roared in my ears as I approached the stairs leading back to the house. I knew the rules. I knew their rules. But I didn't mind May's, a sudden burst of energy. I turned and ran for the door, ignoring the gasps and screams that followed. My feet tapped against the stone steps as I climbed. Each of them felt like it could give way under me. When I got to the main hall, I didn't stop. The front door was there, looming and forbidden, the one I had been warned never to use. The rule flashed in my mind: never use the front door. But I wasn't going to die for his red dress, calm, trembling hands. I grabbed the handle and pulled. The door couldn't resist. It opened with a groan, exposing the cold, dark night beyond. The air outside was biting my lungs as I ran. I didn't look back, not even when I thought I heard footsteps behind me. My feet carried me through the gravel driveway, down the winding path, and onto the main road. The pain in the soles of my feet became unbearable, the sharp stones tearing my skin. But I didn't stop. Not until I saw headlights in the distance, waved my arms frantically, tears streaming down my face as a truck slowed to a stop. The driver, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, looked at me in alarm as I collapsed against his door. "Please," I gasped. "Help me." He asked no questions. He helped me into the taxi and drove me to the nearest police station. When I told my story to the officers, they seemed skeptical. A cult? Sacrifices? A house with rules and rituals? But my disheveled appearance, and the desperation in my voice, seemed to convince them to investigate. They left immediately, a team of police officers going to the address I provided. For the first time in what seemed like weeks, I allowed myself to breathe. But when they returned hours later, their faces told me everything. "There's nothing there," said a police officer, his voice full of confusion. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice cracking. The policeman hesitated. "The house is empty. No furniture, no signs of anyone living there. Only walls." My stomach dropped. "That's impossible. I was there." But they shook their heads, insisting that there was no evidence of anything I described. Then the policeman paused. "There was one thing," he said, pulling out a small plastic bag. Inside was a single sheet of paper. I tore it from his hands, my fingers trembling as I unfolded it. It was blank at first glance, but when my eyes adjusted to the faint letters scrawled on it, my blood ran cold. "You'll never really leave." The words felt alive, pressing my mind with a weight I couldn't shake. I tried to convince myself that it wasn't real, that it was some cruel trick. But that night, when I returned to my temporary motel, the whispers began again, faint, barely audible, but unmistakably familiar. And when I looked at the mirror above the sink, I saw it, not in my face, but behind me, hovering like a shadow I could never escape. The house may have let me go, but I realized then, it still possessed a part of me, and it always would be.